The heavy, rusted iron door groaned on its hinges as Dante kicked it open, his hand already tight on the cold grip of the Beretta holstered at his hip. He had expected to find a rat, a rival, or a drug-fueled traitor selling his secrets to the East Coast. Instead, the air that hit him was thick with the scent of cheap lavender soap and the metallic tang of old radiator steam. The hallway was a narrow throat of peeling blue paint and flickering shadows, ending at the sight of Clara. She stood frozen in the center of the cramped living room, her old black bag dropped at her feet. For 5 years, she had been a ghost in his mansion, a silent fixture in a crisp uniform who moved as if she were afraid to disturb the air he breathed. But here, in the harsh, unflattering light of a single bare bulb, the lie she had been carrying for months was laid bare. She wasn't wearing her oversized, starched apron. The soft cotton of her dress was pulled tight over the unmistakable heavy curve of a pregnancy that looked nearly full term. Dante's breath hitched in his throat, a jagged, painful sound. He felt a coldness spread from his chest to his limbs, a paralysis that made his fingers go numb against his weapon. He didn't move. He couldn't. He was a man who had built an empire on seeing everything coming, yet he had never been more blindsided. Clara's face, usually a mask of professional neutrality, shattered. Her skin turned a sickly paper white, and her eyes, wide and shimmering with a sudden flood of tears, were fixed on him with the raw terror of a cornered animal. She began to tremble, her knees buckling as she slid toward the floor, her hands reaching out to catch herself on the edge of a scarred wooden table. "Mr. Moretti," she whispered, her voice a fragile thread that threatened to snap. "Please." The shock wasn't just the sight of her belly. It was the sudden, violent rush of a memory he had buried under a mountain of whiskey and grief. He looked at her, really looked at her, and the sterile walls of his mansion seemed to dissolve, replaced by the ghost of a rainy night 5 years ago when the world had felt like it was ending. Before he could speak, a door at the end of the short hallway creaked open. A small, dark-haired boy, no older than 4, stepped out into the room. He was rubbing his eyes, his black pajamas printed with fading superheroes. "Mommy?" the boy asked, his voice clear and innocent in the suffocating silence. Dante felt the floor tilt beneath him. He stared at the child, and his heart, which he had believed to be a dead organ since the day his wife was buried, began to beat with a terrifying, rhythmic thud. The boy had a slightly square chin and a way of tilting his head as he studied the stranger, a gesture Dante saw every morning in his own mirror. But it was the eyes that froze him to the marrow. They weren't brown or hazel. They were ink black, deep and endless, a perfect genetic carbon copy of his own. The silence in the room wasn't empty. It was heavy with 5 years of secrets, sacrifices, and a truth that threatened to burn Dante's entire world to the ground. He stood in the doorway, the most powerful man in the city, reduced to a hollow statue by the side of a weeping woman and a boy who shared his blood. He didn't lower his hand from his gun, he simply forgot it was there, his gaze locked onto the child as the realization shattered his inertia. The widowed boss was gone, and in the dim light of that peeling apartment, a man who had forgotten how to feel was forced to breathe again. The sun set over the Chicago skyline, casting long skeletal shadows across the marble floors of the mansion, but Dante felt none of the warmth of the fading light. He stood on the balcony of his study, a silhouette of ink and iron, watching the world through eyes that had grown cold to the touch. For 3 years, his life had been a series of mechanical repetitions, signing contracts that moved millions, orchestrating the quiet removal of rivals, and maintaining an empire that felt more like a cage than a kingdom. He was a machine running on pure inertia, a man who had mastered the art of existing without actually living. Every morning he woke in a bed that felt too large, in a house that was a 3,000 square meter monument to a woman who was never coming back. Grief was a heavy, invisible shroud, and Dante wore it better than his tailored Italian suits. He avoided anything that carried the scent of a memory, anything that might stir the ghosts of the life he had planned with Catherine. But lately, a new variable had entered his sterile equation. His gaze drifted down to the gardens, where Clara was moving silently through the rows of jasmine. She was a ghost within his fortress, a quiet, invisible thread that connected him to a past he was trying to forget. Having worked for him for 5 years, she was a remnant of Catherine's era, a piece of furniture he had overlooked until the silence between them began to grow loud. Unlike his soldiers, who stood at attention with their hearts hammering against their ribs, Clara never looked him in the eye. She was a master of the downward gaze, moving through the halls with a soft, trembling grace that Dante found increasingly agitating. He found himself watching her with a predatory focus that had nothing to do with business. He noticed the way she gripped her tray when he entered a room, the way her hands shook when she set down his glass of whiskey, and the way she seemed to be physically shrinking away from him. There was a tension in her spine that spoke of a secret, a heavy burden that she was carrying beneath the crisp, white lines of her uniform. Dante leaned against the stone railing, his mind churning with a suspicion he couldn't name. He had noticed her morning nausea, the way she clutched the walls for support when she thought he wasn't looking, and the subtle, changing shape of her body that no oversized apron could fully disguise. In his world, secrets were a currency of betrayal, and the sight of her tear-streaked face near the iron gates only fed the paranoia that had kept him alive for decades. He wanted to believe she was merely a girl drowning in her own small life, but the widower in him, the man who had lost everything to a secret, knew better. Tonight, the machine would stop running on inertia and start hunting for the truth. The obsession had moved from the balcony to the interior of the house, a slow-burning itch that Dante could no longer ignore. He moved through the silent corridors of his mansion like a predator stalking a ghost. The air in the estate felt different now. The sterile scent of lemon wax and expensive leather was being choked out by the heavy, suffocating weight of Clara's secrets. Every time she passed him in the hallway, head bowed and breath held, Dante felt a spike of cold electricity. He was a man who had dismantled conspiracies that spanned continents, yet he couldn't decipher the trembling girl who made his bed. Suspicion, once a flicker, became a roar when he found the first thread of the betrayal. It happened in the quiet hour before dawn, a time when the house belonged only to him and the shadows. He had entered the service pantry, driven by a restlessness that whiskey couldn't drown, and his eyes fell upon a discarded waste bin near Clara's workstation. It was an intrusion of privacy he would have once found beneath him, but the machine in his chest demanded data. Tucked beneath a layer of crumpled paper was a small, amber plastic vial. Dante picked it up, his tattooed fingers looking brutal against the delicate plastic. There was no name on the label, only a series of numbers and a handwritten instruction to take it twice daily. It was a medication he didn't recognize, but the secrecy of the unmarked bottle sent his mind spiraling toward the worst-case scenario. In the underworld, unmarked vials usually meant one of two things: a slow-acting poison or a payment in kind for services rendered to a rival family. The thought that the quiet, invisible Clara was a sleeper agent for the East Coast Syndicate hit him like a physical blow. His paranoia deepened an hour later. He was standing in the shadows of the library when he heard the soft, frantic murmur of a voice coming from the servants' stairwell. It was Clara. She was speaking in a hushed, pleading tone he had never heard her use. "I have the money," she whispered, her voice cracking with a desperation that made the hair on the back of Dante's neck stand up. "I'll bring the rest tonight. Just don't let them go. Please, I'm doing everything I can." Dante's hand instinctively went to the heavy weight of the handgun at his small of his back. "I have the money." The phrase echoed in his mind with the cold finality of a death sentence. To him, there was only one reason a maid in his house would need large sums of untraceable cash. She was buying her way out of a debt or selling his head to the highest bidder. He imagined her meeting a contact in some rain-slicked alley, handing over floor plans of his security system or the codes to his private safe. He watched her through the cracked door as she tucked a burner phone into the deep pocket of her apron, her face ashen and her eyes rimmed with red. She looked like a woman walking toward her own execution, yet she didn't realize the executioner was standing 5 feet away, watching her every move. The grief that had been his only companion for 3 years was suddenly replaced by a sharp, focused rage. He had trusted her, in his own distant way, because she was a link to Catherine, a thread of the life he used to have. But if she was a rat, he would have to exterminate her. He decided then that he wouldn't confront her in the safety of the mansion. He wanted to see who she was meeting. He wanted to see the face of the man who thought he could use Dante Moretti's own staff to bring him down. He followed her back to the kitchen, watching as she carefully wiped a counter with hands that wouldn't stop shaking. She was a masterpiece of deception, or she was a woman on the edge of a total collapse. As he turned to retreat into the darkness of his study, Dante felt a grim resolve settle over him. The red thread of her betrayal was unraveling, and he was going to follow it until it led him to the throat of whoever was pulling her strings. The transition from the iron-willed master of the estate to a ghost in the city streets required a shedding of his skin. Dante bypassed the row of armored Bentleys and the fleet of black SUVs that usually served as his chariot of power, opting instead for a nondescript, charcoal gray sedan buried in the back of the service garage. He waved off his security detail with a sharp, final gesture that brooked no argument, a silent command that left his men standing in the shadows, confused and wary. He didn't want the spectacle of a motorcade. He wanted the invisibility of a shadow. He waited at the edge of the estate's long, winding driveway, the engine of the sedan idling with a quiet, suppressed hum. When the heavy iron gates groaned open to let the public bus lumber past the bus stop at the corner, he saw her. Clara was a small, fragile figure huddled on a plastic bench, her old black bag clutched to her chest like a shield. She looked smaller out here, stripped of the mansion's grandeur, just another weary soul lost in the machinery of the city. As she stepped onto the bus, her movements were heavy, burdened by a fatigue that seemed to seep into her very bones. Dante pulled into the flow of traffic, keeping 3 cars between himself and the lumbering yellow and white transit bus. He moved with a practiced, predatory patience, his tattooed hands relaxed on the steering wheel, even as his mind hummed with a violent static. He watched the city change through the windshield, the gleaming glass towers of the financial district giving way to the jagged, industrial skeletons of the midtown warehouses. The further the bus traveled, the more the world began to decay. Soon, the paved roads turned into a patchwork of potholes and cracked asphalt. The scenery shifted into a landscape of crumbling brick, boarded-up windows, and the skeletal remains of playgrounds. This was a part of Chicago that the city's maps preferred to forget, a place where the air felt thick with the smell of damp earth, garbage, and the lingering rot of forgotten dreams. Dante hadn't set foot in a neighborhood like this in years. In his world, power was measured in marble and high-altitude glass. Here, it was measured in survival and the strength of the locks on a rusted door. When the bus finally wheezed to a halt at a corner marked by a leaning street lamp, Clara stepped off. She stood on the sidewalk for a moment, glancing over her shoulder with a frantic, wide-eyed look that made Dante's heart tighten with a sudden, unbidden pang of empathy. She wasn't looking for a contact. She was looking for a threat. He watched her disappear down a narrow alleyway, her silhouette swallowed by the long shadows of the tenements. He parked the sedan in the shadow of a derelict car wash and stepped out. The cold, damp air hitting his face like a physical reprimand. The sounds of the neighborhood were a jarring symphony of struggle. The distant, rhythmic thud of bass from a passing car, the sharp bark of a stray dog, and the haunting, high-pitched cry of a child from an open window above. It was a sound that pierced through his armor, stirring a primal protective instinct he thought had died with his wife. He followed her on foot, his expensive leather boots silent on the cracked pavement. He moved with the ease of a man who was no stranger to the dark, his gaze fixed on the bobbing movement of her head in the distance. She led him deeper into the labyrinth of brick, eventually stopping before a building that looked as though it were being held together by nothing more than grit and the stubbornness of its inhabitants. The paint was peeling in large, sickly flakes, and the iron fire escapes were choked with rust. As he watched her push open the heavy, groaned door and vanish inside, Dante felt the red thread of suspicion pull taut. He didn't know what he would find behind those walls: a drug den, a rival's hideout, or the proof of a betrayal that would force his hand. But the intuition that had kept him alive for decades was screaming. This wasn't the behavior of a spy. This was the desperate flight of someone with everything to lose. He reached into his jacket, his fingers brushing the cold steel of his weapon, and stepped into the darkness of the doorway, following the sound of her receding footsteps up the creaking stairs. The stench of the tenement was a suffocating cocktail of damp mold, stale cooking grease, and the sharp, chemical tang of cheap cleaning fluid. Dante stepped into the foyer, his expensive presence an affront to the decaying surroundings. The weak, flickering yellow light overhead hummed like a dying insect, casting long, distorted shadows of his tattooed arms against the water-stained walls. Every step he took up the narrow stairwell was a protest of wood and metal. The stairs groaned beneath his weight, a rhythmic creak that sounded like the house itself was gasping for air. First floor, second floor, third floor. He moved with the calculated silence of a man who had hunted in far more dangerous jungles than this, but the air here felt heavier, thick with a desperation that pulled at his lungs. He kept his breathing steady, his hand resting instinctively on the cold grip of the weapon beneath his jacket, though his heart was beginning to race with a tempo he couldn't control. He reached the fourth floor and stopped. The hallway was a dark tunnel, illuminated only by a single dim bulb at the far end that pulsed as if it were about to give out. He saw which door Clara had disappeared behind, a heavy wooden slab at the end of the corridor, its blue paint faded and chipped away like dead skin. Dante approached with the predatory grace of a wolf, his boots making no sound on the warped linoleum. He pressed his back against the icy wall beside the door, his senses dialed to a razor's edge. He expected to hear the low murmur of men's voices, the rustle of maps, or the clink of currency. Instead, a sound broke the silence that made his entire world tilt. It was a child's voice, high, clear, and vibrating with an excitement that didn't belong in a place this bleak. "Mommy, you're back! Did you bring the blue crayons?" Dante went completely still. The freeze was instantaneous, a paralysis that started in his chest and turned his blood to lead. His hand dropped from his weapon, his fingers suddenly numb. This wasn't a meeting of spies. "I'm here, sweetheart," came Clara's voice, and the transformation was so total it was jarring. Gone was the trembling, stuttering maid of the Moretti estate. In her place was a woman whose tone was a warm, protective embrace. "I didn't get the crayons today, Ethan, but I brought some extra bread from the big house. Are you hungry?" Ethan. The name hit Dante with the force of a physical blow. He moved, almost against his will, stepping in front of the door just as it swung inward. Clara stood there, her hand frozen on the knob, the blood draining from her face until she was as white as the lilies Catherine used to grow. She looked at him, and for a heartbeat, neither of them breathed. Her eyes were wide with a terror so profound it was visceral. She instinctively shifted her body to block his view of the room behind her. But she wasn't fast enough. A small boy, no older than 4, scrambled into view, his black hair tousled as if he'd just woken from a nap. He was wearing faded pajamas, his small hand clutching a plastic toy car. He stopped when he saw the towering stranger in the doorway, his head tilting to the side in a gesture of pure, innocent curiosity. Dante felt the floor beneath him dissolve. He stared at the child. And time simply ceased to exist. He wasn't looking at a stranger's son. He was looking into a mirror that reached back 5 years into his own past. The boy had the same square, stubborn set to his jaw, the same straight line of his nose, but it was the eyes that shattered Dante's soul. They were ink black, deep, and endless, a terrifyingly perfect match to the eyes Dante saw every morning when he looked at his own reflection. The boy tilted his head again, studying Dante with a focused intensity that Catherine used to tease him about, saying he looked like a puppy trying to solve a riddle. The resemblance wasn't just a coincidence. It was a biological scream. In that dark, mold-scented hallway, the powerful mafia boss who had survived car bombings and street wars felt his knees buckle. The shock was a cold blade through the heart of his inertia. He wasn't just a widower anymore. He was a man standing in the wreckage of a 5-year-old lie, staring at a child who carried his blood, his features, and his future. Dante pushed past the threshold, his presence filling the cramped apartment until the walls seemed to shrink. He didn't draw his weapon. He didn't need to. The sheer weight of his silence was more lethal than any bullet. Clara stumbled back, her hands flying to her mouth to stifle a sob of pure, unadulterated horror. She looked like a woman watching her executioner walk into her living room, her eyes darting between Dante and the boy, her body trembling with such violence that the small table beside her rattled. "Ethan, go to your room," Clara choked out, her voice a ragged plea. "Now, sweetheart. Please." The boy, sensing the sudden shift in the air, the way the oxygen seemed to have been sucked out of the room by the giant with the tattooed neck, didn't argue. He looked at Dante one last time with those hauntingly familiar black eyes, clutching his toy car to his chest before scurrying behind the bedroom door. The click of the latch sounded like a gavel coming down in a death penalty case. Dante didn't look at the furniture or the peeling wallpaper. He kept his gaze locked on Clara. "How old is he?" The question was low, a vibration of gravel and ice that seemed to vibrate in the floorboards. Clara couldn't meet his eyes. She was staring at his boots, her hands gripped so tight in her apron that her knuckles were white. "How old, Clara?" he roared, the sound cracking the silence of the tenement. "4," she whispered, the word barely audible over the humming of the ancient refrigerator. He turned 4 last month." Dante felt a sickening lurch in his gut. The math didn't just add up, it screamed. He closed his eyes for a second, and the darkness behind his lids was suddenly flooded with the memory of a night he had spent years trying to wash away with expensive scotch. 5 years ago, the night the doctors had sat him and Catherine down in that sterile white office and told them their dream was dead. Catherine's body would never carry a child. He remembered the soul-crushing grief. He remembered sending Catherine to her mother so she wouldn't see him break. He remembered the bottle of Macallan, then the second, then the blur of the mansion's library. He remembered a pair of kind, steady hands helping him up from the floor, a soft voice telling him he wasn't alone, and a moment of shared, desperate vulnerability where he had reached out for the only human warmth left in his cold, empty world. He had woken up the next morning alone, his mind a static-filled void, assuming he had simply passed out in his shame. "That night," Dante said, his voice raw, stripped of its usual authority, "the night after the clinic, I thought I dreamed you." Clara finally looked up, her face slick with tears. "You didn't dream me, Dante. You were dying. You were a man whose heart had just been ripped out, and I loved Kate. I loved you both. I just wanted to stop you from shaking." She let out a broken laugh that sounded more like a gasp. "But you woke up and didn't remember. You looked at me like I was just the girl who brought your coffee. And then Kate came back, and she was so sad, so broken by the news. How could I tell her? How could I tell the woman who was like a sister to me that I was carrying the one thing she wanted most in the world? The one thing she could never have? Dante felt the floor tilt. He looked around the 40-square-meter apartment. The cheap toys, the stained walls, the smell of poverty. And then thought of his 3,000-square-meter tomb of a house. For 4 years, his son had been eating off a scratched wooden table while he sat at the head of a mahogany banquet board, alone. "You let me believe I had nothing," Dante whispered, the betrayal cutting deeper than any rival's blade. "You let me live in that house like a ghost, while my son, was growing up in this." "I was protecting her," Clara shrieked, her fear finally giving way to a mother's fierce defiance. "I was protecting Kate. And then, after the accident, after she was gone, I saw you. You became a monster of grief. I was afraid, Dante. I am still afraid. Look at you. You followed me here to kill a traitor. What would you do to a woman who stole 4 years of your life?" Dante looked at her, then at the closed bedroom door where the boy, Ethan, was waiting. The shock was fading, replaced by a terrifying, newfound clarity. He wasn't going to kill anyone. He reached out, his hand trembling as he touched the frame of the door. He had found a secret that made him freeze, but in the heat of his rising blood, he realized the machine was finally broken. He was a father. The rain had been a relentless, drumming roar against the stained glass windows of the mansion's library, a sound that mirrored the chaotic disintegration of Dante's soul. 5 years ago, the world had not been a place of cold inertia, but a battlefield of raw, bleeding agony. He sat on the floor, his back against the mahogany bookshelves, surrounded by a sea of medical files and an empty bottle of whiskey that had failed to numb the doctor's words. Infertility. A biological dead end. The Moretti line ended with him, and the dream that kept Kate smiling through the darkness of his profession had been extinguished in a sterile office earlier that afternoon. He had sent Kate away to her mother's, unable to look at her without seeing the reflection of his own failure. He was a man who moved mountains and silenced kings, yet he was powerless against the betrayal of his own blood. The shadows of the room seemed to close in, heavy with the scent of old paper and the sharp medicinal sting of the alcohol. He had been weeping, not the quiet, dignified grief of a boss, but the ragged, ugly sobs of a man who had lost his North Star. The door had creaked open, a sliver of warm light cutting through the gloom. Clara had stepped in, her eyes wide with a compassion that felt like a physical touch. To Kate, Clara was the younger sister she never had. To Dante, she had been a silent, dependable shadow in the periphery of his domestic life. She didn't turn on the lamps. She didn't offer platitudes. She simply sat on the floor beside him, her presence a quiet anchor in the storm of his intoxication. "She'll hate me," Dante had slurred, his voice thick and unrecognizable. "I'm a dead branch, Clara. I can't give her the only thing that matters." Clara had reached out then, her hand steady and warm against his trembling shoulder. "She could never hate you, Dante. She loves you more than life itself." In his drunken haze, the boundaries of his world had blurred. The grief had stripped him of his armor, leaving behind a man who was starving for a connection that didn't feel like a funeral. He had turned toward her, seeking shelter from the cold reality of the medical reports scattered like fallen leaves around them. Clara hadn't pulled away. In her eyes there was a reflection of the same loneliness, a shared history of serving a house that was now drowning in sorrow. The night had shifted then, moving from words to a desperate, wordless need for comfort. It wasn't an act of calculated betrayal. It was two people clinging to each other in the middle of a shipwreck. Dante remembered the softness of her skin and the way her hair smelled of jasmine, the same jasmine that Kate loved, and for a few hours, the pain had been replaced by a hollow, feverish heat. He had fallen into a heavy, alcohol-induced stupor, cradled by the very secret that would eventually shatter his life. When the first gray light of morning filtered through the library windows, the storm had passed, leaving behind a cold, clinical silence. Dante had woken on the sofa, his head throbbing and his throat parched. The room was empty. The bottle had been cleared away, the medical files neatly stacked on his desk as if they were nothing more than business ledgers. He remembered the grief. He remembered the whiskey. But the middle of the night was a fragmented mosaic of shadows and touch that his brain, protective and reeling, had filed away as a hallucination born of trauma and grained spirit. He had walked into the kitchen an hour later, his face a mask of restored discipline. Clara was there, her back to him as she prepared his coffee. When she turned, her eyes were rimmed with red, but her expression was the same invisible, professional mask she always wore. Dante had looked right through her, his mind already calculating how to face Kate, how to lie about his strength, and how to bury the memory of his breakdown. He didn't see the way her hands shook as she handed him his cup. He didn't see the look of profound, agonizing guilt that she quickly swallowed down. He had forgotten the night, and in doing so, he had sentenced Clara to a 5-year prison of silence, carrying the weight of his legacy while he lived in a house of stone. The silence that followed the flashback was heavy, vibrating with the ghost of the jasmine-scented rain from 5 years ago. Dante stood in the center of the cramped, peeling apartment, his presence a dark stain against the domestic humility of Clara's world. He looked at her, not as the invisible maid who polished his silver, but as the woman who had held his shattering soul together for one night, and then spent half a decade paying for it in the dark. Clara's voice was steady now, though her hands remained clamped over her pregnant belly as if shielding the new life within from the storm radiating off him. "You asked why I hid him," she began, her eyes finally meeting his with a weary, heartbreaking clarity. "You think I did it out of spite? To rob you of an heir? Dante, I did it because I loved her. I loved Kate more than I feared you." She moved toward the small dining table, leaning heavily against the scratched wood. "After that night, when the fog cleared and the whiskey wore off, I saw you look at Kate. I saw the way you held her, the way you both mourned the children you thought you'd never have. If I had spoken up then, I wouldn't have just been telling you I was pregnant. I would have been telling Kate that her husband found comfort in the arms of the help while she was away. I would have been the living proof that she was broken and I was whole. It would have killed her spirit long before that car bomb ever touched her." Dante flinched, the truth of her words cutting through his defensive anger. He remembered Kate's fragile smile, the way she had clung to him after the infertility diagnosis. Clara was right. The revelation would have been a jagged blade in an already bleeding heart. "I chose to be the villain in my own story so she could keep her perfect life," Clara continued, a single tear tracing a path through the dust on her cheek. "I took the 6 months of leave. I hid in this neighborhood, in this very room, listening to the sirens and the screaming, just so Kate wouldn't have to see my stomach grow. When Ethan was born, I looked at his eyes, your eyes, and I realized I could never go back as anything other than a shadow. I was a ghost in your house because it was the only way to stay near the only family I had left without burning the whole mansion down with the truth." She let out a dry, ragged breath. "Then Kate died, and I watched you turn into stone. I watched you become a man of ice and ink, someone who didn't care if he lived or died. I wanted to tell you then, Dante. I stood outside your study door 1,000 times with Ethan's name on my tongue. But how could I? You were drowning in the perfect memory of a wife who was a saint. If I told you then, I would have tainted that memory. I would have forced you to realize that your grieving process was built on a night of betrayal. I thought it was better for you to be a lonely king than a man who hated himself for what we did." Dante felt the weight of her sacrifice, a 5-year prison of poverty, silence, and labor, all to protect a dead woman's peace and a living man's pride. She had cleaned his floors and served his meals while their son slept in a room the size of his walk-in closet, all to maintain the sanctity of a marriage that was already haunted. The burden of silence hadn't just been hers. She had carried his guilt, his legacy, and his future on her narrow shoulders, asking for nothing but the right to remain invisible. "It wasn't a mistake to me, Dante," she whispered, her voice dropping to a soft, dangerous pitch. "Ethan wasn't a mistake, but our world, the mafia, the blood, the rules, that is the mistake. I kept him here because here, he was mine. In your house, he would have been a target. He would have been a successor. I wanted him to be a boy." Dante looked at the door where Ethan had disappeared, the realization of his own blindness hitting him with the force of a landslide. He had spent years guarding an empty throne, never realizing that the true kingdom had been built in a crumbling tenement by a woman he had never bothered to truly see. The perfect image of his past was gone, replaced by the raw, bleeding reality of a sacrifice he wasn't sure he was worthy of. The heavy silence of the apartment was punctured by the rhythmic, mechanical hum of the dying refrigerator, a sound that seemed to count the seconds of Dante's unraveling. He stood there, his gaze dropping from Clara's defiant face to her hands, which remained protectively cradled over the swell of her stomach. The realization of Ethan's existence had been a tectonic shift, a violent restructuring of his past, but as he looked at the way Clara moved, the way she winced as she shifted her weight, the sheer physical toll evident in the dark circles beneath her eyes, a second, sharper shock pierced through the initial layer of awe. "You're not just hiding the past, Clara," Dante said, his voice dropping into a register of terrifyingly soft clarity. He took a step toward her, his shadow swallowing her small frame. The tattooed serpent on his neck seemed to coil as he moved. "This pregnancy? It isn't 5 years old. It's now." Clara recoiled as if he had struck her, her back hitting the cold, damp wall. The terror that had begun to ebb during her confession returned with a frantic, pulsing energy. She didn't answer, but she didn't have to. The physical reality of her body was a truth he could no longer overlook. The red thread he had followed led not just to a son he had missed, but to a new life currently unfolding in the midst of this squalor. "Who is he?" Dante demanded, his hands curling into fists at his sides. The thought of another man touching her, of another man's blood mingling with the woman who had carried his son in secret, ignited a territorial rage he didn't know he still possessed. "The man who did this to you, the man who left you in this rot while you're carrying his child. Give me a name." Clara let out a short, hysterical sob that ended in a gasp of pain. "There is no name, Dante. There is no one. He's gone. He was a shadow, a promise of a life that didn't involve cleaning your blood-stained floors. He saw the reality of a woman with a 4-year-old and a baby on the way, and he vanished before the ink was dry on the test." The image of her standing in this room, alone, facing the arrival of another child while balancing the weight of his own hidden son, made Dante's vision blur with a dark, suffocating heat. He saw the discarded prenatal vitamins again in his mind, the secret phone calls to clinics, the pleading for more time with the landlord. She wasn't just a martyr for his late wife, she was a woman drowning in a sea of abandonment, clutching 2 anchors of his and another's making. "You were going to do this again?" Dante's voice was raw, stripped of the mafia boss's iron and replaced by a man's pure, unadulterated horror. "You were going to bring another life into this, alone, without a word to me?" "What choice did I have?" Clara screamed, the sound echoing off the thin walls. "I am a maid, Dante. To the world, I am nothing. To you, I was a ghost. Should I have come to the great Moretti and asked for a raise because I was foolish enough to want to be loved for 5 minutes? You wouldn't have even looked up from your ledger." Dante froze. The truth of her words was a mirror he didn't want to look into. He had been a machine of inertia, a man who treated the humans in his house like the marble they polished. He had been so consumed by the perfect ghost of Catherine that he had allowed the living woman carrying his legacy to starve in a tenement. And now, there was a second heartbeat, a new life that owed nothing to his bloodline, but everything to his protection. The shock intensified as he realized the sheer scale of her isolation. She was a woman carrying a second child in a war zone, with no husband, no family, and a mafia boss who had followed her with a gun. He looked at the small, cheap plastic toys on the floor and the drawings taped to the water-stained walls. This wasn't just a discovery of a son. It was an indictment of his entire existence. The freeze that had gripped him since he entered the building finally began to thaw, replaced by a violent, protective instinct that overrode every rule of his world. He didn't care about the other man. He didn't care about the mistake of her recent encounter. All he saw was the woman who had sacrificed her youth to protect his wife's memory, now standing on the precipice of a second, lonely labor. The second heartbeat was a ticking clock. "No more," Dante whispered, reaching out and finally, for the first time in 5 years, placing his hand gently over hers, feeling the warmth of her through the thin fabric of her dress. "No more silence. No more tenements. You are done being alone, Clara. Whether that child is mine or a stranger's, you are carrying it under the shadow of my name now." Before she could respond, the sound of a heavy engine idling too loudly on the street below filtered through the cracked window. Dante's predatory instincts, suppressed by the emotional onslaught, suddenly snapped back into place. He knew that sound. It wasn't the transit bus. It was the low, aggressive growl of a rival's charger. The secret wasn't just his anymore. The sharks had smelled the blood in the water. The aggressive growl of the engine outside faded into the background, eclipsed by the deafening roar of the silence inside the room. Dante stood in the center of the cramped apartment, his shadow stretching long across the drawings of suns and trees Ethan had taped to the peeling walls. He looked at his hand, the hand that had ordered deaths and moved millions, still resting near Clara's stomach. The machine that had governed his life for 3 years. That cold, unfeeling engine of inertia didn't just stop. It shattered. The weight of it all, the 4 years of Ethan's life he had missed, the 5 years of Clara's lonely sacrifice, the second heartbeat of a child whose mother was currently trembling under the weight of poverty, slammed into him with the force of a physical collapse. Dante's legs, the pillars of an empire, finally gave way. He slid down the water-stained wall, his spine scraping against the rough surface until he hit the linoleum floor. Then, the most feared man in the city did something the underworld would never believe. He broke. The tears didn't come with a sob. They were silent, heavy tracks that cut through the grit on his face and fell onto his expensive leather jacket. He wept for Kate, whose memory had been used as a shield for a truth that would have given her life. He wept for Ethan, who had spent his infancy in a room smaller than a walk-in closet. But mostly he wept for the man he had become, a king of ashes who had been so busy mourning the dead that he had failed to see the living. A small, hesitant touch brushed against his shoulder. Dante opened his eyes to see Ethan standing there, the boy's ink-black eyes wide with a child's instinctive empathy. Ethan didn't know about mafia wars or biological legacies. He only saw a man who looked like he was drowning. The boy reached out and wiped a tear from Dante's cheek with a thumb that smelled of plastic toys and cheap bread. "Don't cry, mister," the boy whispered. "Mom says the damp makes the walls sad, but we can fix them." Dante let out a ragged, broken laugh that was half-gasp. He reached out, his tattooed hands shaking as he pulled the boy into his chest. Ethan was solid, warm, and real. A miracle born from a night of darkness. Over the boy's shoulder, Dante looked at Clara. She was still standing by the table, her face a mask of exhausted disbelief, watching the man she had feared for half a decade crumble at her feet. "Never again," Dante said, his voice raw and vibrating with a new, terrifying resolve. He stood up, lifting Ethan into his arms as if the boy were the only thing keeping him tethered to the earth. He looked at Clara, his eyes burning with a fire that hadn't been seen since the day his world ended. "You will never breathe this air again. You will never smell the stink of dampness or wonder if the lights will stay on. You've carried my blood and my secrets in the dark for too long, Clara. It's time you were protected by them." He didn't wait for her to pack. He grabbed her old black bag and threw it over his shoulder, his other arm locked firmly around his son. He led them out of the apartment, down the creaking, groaning stairs that had been Clara's daily climb, and out into the freezing Chicago night. The charcoal gray sedan was waiting, a discreet vessel for a total transformation. As they drove back toward the exclusive suburbs, the city lights blurred into a streak of gold and white. Clara sat in the passenger seat, her eyes fixed on the horizon, her hands finally relaxing in her lap. Ethan was already fast asleep in the back, his head resting against the expensive leather that he would soon come to know as home. When they reached the iron gates of the estate, Dante didn't stop at the service entrance. He drove straight to the front of the 3,000-square-meter mansion, the headlights illuminating the marble columns and the jasmine gardens. He killed the engine and sat in the silence for a moment, looking at the house that had been his tomb. "This isn't a house of grief anymore," he told Clara, his voice steadying into the tone of a man who had found a new mission. "This is a sanctuary for Ethan, for you, and for the one on the way." He stepped out and opened the door for her, helping her out with a tenderness that was an apology for every day he had ignored her. He carried Ethan across the threshold, the boy's small head tucked into the crook of his tattooed neck. The widowed boss stayed on the driveway, a ghost of the past. As the heavy front doors clicked shut, Dante Moretti didn't see a mansion. He saw a fortress. The inertia was gone. For the first time in 5 years, he wasn't just existing. He was a father, and he would burn the world to the ground to keep the secret he had found in the dark safe in the light.